Zunächst danke, Jörg, für die sehr freundliche Begrüßung. Es ist wirklich eine Freude hier.
Thank you very much for these friendly words of introduction, and I'm pleased to be here, and I will switch to English.
To the Bell Foundation for having me this evening, and to apologize to those who've been taking part in the day-long conversations for not being able to be present. I had family commitments today. I also want to apologize, I think, for the rather grim subject matter that you've asked me to address. I don't know whether this is going to give the long and productive day a happy ending. Perhaps it will confirm and supercharge ideas that you've already had. I hope at least it's a clarifying effort to make sense of what's going on. Coming to you from the United States, our mood is tense, I have to say, and as I was leaving, literally as I was on the car to JFK, the news of the ban on foreign students at Harvard broke. And to be honest, I don't want to go back. But we move on, and I want to think onwards with you. I also want to thank I want to thank Jörg in particular for actually giving me my prompt, which could hardly be more dramatic, or it almost has a kind of dark comedy to it, which is that, let's see whether we can move this. Is this going to work for us, folks, on the AV? The button's not working. The monitors are blinking on and off, and the button, there we go. Is this going to go? Okay, yes. So the dark comedy, really worthy of Nietzsche, was the moment that many of you may have missed in the blur of extraordinary news that's come across us in the first months of this year, which is the first week of March 2025, in which the United States became the only nation in the UN General Assembly to formally vote against the nomination of a day of hope and peaceful coexistence. A truly dramatic day in the history of American UN General Assembly diplomacy, which is a checkered and fascinating history going back over decades, but this surely has to go down in the record as one of the more remarkable moments. And it was made even more remarkable by the letter which the United States provided to the United Nations explaining why it was against appointing a day of hope and peaceful coexistence. And this culminates, after much humming and hawing, in the extraordinary statement that I've bolded at the bottom, which is that the United States rejects and denounces the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, and will no longer reaffirm them as a matter of course. So this is not simply the United States absenting itself from the Paris Accords. It is explicitly rejecting the entire ambition of the Sustainable Development Agenda, which, if there is a common denominator of the folks in this room right now, I imagine that's it, right? That's our common denominator. We can all wear the pin with the multicolored spiral. We're kind of signed up. We're kind of signed up to that. And you can see that they add, furthermore, a political justification. In the last US election, the mandate from the American people was clear. The government of the United States must refocus on the interests of Americans. We must care first and foremost for our own. That is our moral and civic duty. President Trump also sets a clear and overdue course correction on gender and climate ideology, which pervades the SDGs. So this is a full frontal populist manifesto against the commonly agreed agenda of global development that was set in 2015. And he goes on in a very interesting way to expand this into a broader geopolitical frame, which is to spell out, and this is a move which is quite significant, I think, what it takes to be another element of hidden politics, right? The resolution's titular reference to peaceful coexistence could be co-opted to imply the UN's endorsement of China's 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Any attempt to imply such endorsement could undermine UN's independence. Similarly, the concept of dialogue amongst civilizations is rooted in President Xi Jinping's Global Civilization Initiative. So there is here an effort to expose social SDG agenda, bland, you might think, UN talk, as effectively ridden with CCP ideology that presumably we're either complicit with or too naive to realize is actually going on. And this is the reality that I think we need to understand and gauge the significance of. One possible reaction is the one that I think is shared by the vast majority of the people in this room, which is one of shock. It's in the framing of the introductory statement to this conference. What are we going to do in light of the American default? And I think this is our starting point, and it's our common starting point. But there are other ways in which you might react. Another way would be to say, well, fine, fair enough, of course this is shocking, but why are we really bewailing America's renunciation of the SDGs when they, in fact, have delivered so little? When, in fact, this has been an agenda which has been notable principally for its failure to actually deliver. And furthermore, you might even say, answering the Americans with their own cynicism, it's kind of above time, beyond time, high time, for them to speak frankly how they feel. And there's no question at all that for many years, powerful voices in Washington have felt exactly like this about the SDG. And at the very least, we can say that the Trump administration is sparing us the hypocrisy. This is what they actually felt, which would help to explain why the SDGs delivered so little. At least now we're playing with open cards, mit offenen Karten. Right? With offenem Visier, as the Germans would say, with the visor open. We know what we're about at this moment. The problem, it seems to me, is not that we had a working model that was adequate to the escalating crisis that we all know is multiplying around us, that was willfully disrupted by the Americans. Back to its origins in the 1980s, as Jörg endlessly reminds me, sustainable development was always above all an aspiration. It wasn't an achieved reality, it was an aspiration. It was an effort to close by policy, by thinking, by common thinking, a gap between reality and what we, many of us at least, would agree would be a desirable state of affairs. It was also a sustainable development agenda that had a distinctly European flavor, and I think we should admit this. As Europeans, allow me to call myself a European. It had a German flavor, it had a Brandt, it had a Brundtland, it had a Heinrich-Böll, it had a Green Party kind of flavor to it. And the double movement of 2015, the Paris agreements, and months before that, the Sustainable Development Resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly generalized that, translated that into a global agenda in a way that had never been done before, and I think is rightly seen by many of the protagonists as the culmination of a decades-long campaign, starting in the 1970s, to achieve this. But I think the question as a historian, with the hindsight that we now have post-Trump, is whether it was really the culmination, or whether actually it was something more like Last Chance Saloon. This was the last moment, if you like, in which a Western-led conception of sustainable development could achieve the kind of universal assent that it did in 2015. And what we've seen with Trump is not so much a shocking and scandalous denouement that, oh my God, the Americans have defected, as really rather more the predictable realization that time has run out on this paradigm. Time has run out on this paradigm. And Trump has called time. And I'm going to offer that as the alternative interpretation of a historian, and a kind of early sketch of how we might write the history of this moment. Let's be frank, and I think it is time to be frank, and one of the things that this moment may help us and enable us to do is to be truthful with each other. The 2015 agenda was not delivering, I would submit. It was not delivering on the scale that we need. One could point to various different dimensions. I've been involved with the Stiglitz and Guzman-led campaign on finance and debt, but you could also look at the just energy transition partnerships, for instance, which I know Jörg and I share an interest in, which were the highlight of the Glasgow GFANs, and are really, when you dig into the details, an embarrassing failure of Western development policy. It wasn't working. And so to reiterate my point, Trump's America is not disrupting a system that was adequate. It's disrupting a non-system that was not adequate to address even the current challenges, let alone the escalating polycrises that we can all point to and that we all know are coming away, and ultimately fuel the urgency which so many of us feel, which is we ain't seen nothing yet. This is just the beginning of the combination of crises that we're going to be facing. So 2025, in my view, marks not just an uncouth and embarrassing disruption of the paradigm by the American presidency, but the moment at which I think we have to face the historical obsolescence of a Western-led sustainable development paradigm. Why does America matter so much? You might say, hang on, isn't Tooze exaggerating the significance of all of this? Is this not somebody who's basically traumatized by American politics right now? That'll be fair. There's definitely that vibe. But if you dig into it, it isn't difficult, I think, in dimension after dimension to think through the way in which American power actually does manage. And I think we should check ourselves in the months to come and when we try and calm ourselves by saying, oh, well, we can get by without the Americans. Just look at this list and then tell yourself that again. Right? So the US market for imports, this is the axis of their trade policy influence. Wall Street for finance, the reach of the American legal system that my colleagues at Columbia Law School write about so powerfully, the reach of the American national security apparatus, going all the way back perhaps in German consciousness to the NSA spying affair of the early 2010s, the predominant role of the United States as a single concerted actor in ODA. If you add up all the Europeans, you get to big numbers too, but they're not acting as a single actor, whereas the Americans, at least for a while, were. The dominant role of American private philanthropy, which behind the scenes we all know plays an extraordinarily important role also in European climate activism, for instance. A lot of that is American money. They're deploying it in Europe because they know it gets them more bang for the buck in Europe than it will in the United States. But it's there in the background nevertheless. The predominance of US-anchored universities as centers of thinking and American think tanks, which is not by any means uncontested but real. Just look at the career paths of so many people involved in global world. I know that one of my Vorredner this morning was involved in a commencement in New York just a month or two ago. That kind of influence is singular to the US. And then, of course, finally, there is the voting share of the United States in the Bretton Woods institutions, which whenever we get serious about talking about large-scale global financial reform, you end up running into Congress. And that is the blockage when you start seriously thinking about what the IMF and the World Bank might actually do. So this crisis in the US, I would submit, is real. And we are kidding ourselves if we think we can walk away from it. It's a dramatic development. But is the American rejection, as shocking as it is, surprising? Obviously, I'm asking a rhetorical question, and you can see that I've been building up to a degree of skepticism here. But I want to sort of force you to think about the logic here of great power politics. I mean, why is it that we convinced ourselves that it was plausible that the Americans would be serious about sustainable development? I mean, that on and of itself is not an obvious claim. It's not an obvious assumption to make. It came out of the development ideologies, the modernization ideologies of the Cold War. But if you think about the logic of those, it was development for those people in our camp, within our Cold War camp, and it was development on a scale which didn't fundamentally challenge the balance of power. So the classic paradigm success story is South Korea, which is a frontline state in the Cold War, miserably impoverished in the 1950s and early 1960s. Difficult now to make ourselves an impression of just how impoverished South Korea was. North Korea was ahead of South Korea in the 50s in economic terms. And now is this triumphant modernist success story that even as a military dictatorship, we were happy to celebrate, and now celebrate even more given that it's transitioned to a contestable, vibrant, pluralistic polity. But that's no test, I would submit, because it's South Korea. It's essentially a client state of the United States. And as dramatic as that growth is, it doesn't pose any challenge to United States hegemony. Japan was already difficult, but of course the ultimate test case of the compatibility of the existing status quo of global power with large-scale development globally is China. And China has emerged as a profound challenge to the compatibility of these two ideals. One would be global stability anchored in the status quo power system, and the other one would be global development. China's growth is clearly the greatest development success story in human history, bar none. It's not even arguable in terms of the scale of the transition from poverty to bearable prosperity. China, not just as a result of COVID, has a longer life expectancy than the United States today. That's a staggering fact compared to where China was in the 1960s. But it has blown the environmental equation up, and there is no getting around that fact because of the scale of Chinese CO2 emissions. And it has emerged from the United States' point of view as a fundamental challenge at the level of what we call in social science ontological security, the sort of destabilization that we blame, for instance, for voters going to the AfD in Germany. It has destabilized the United States both at the level of national security on the global stage and what the economists call the China shock, to which Americans attribute an incredible array of domestic social dysfunction, is attached to the supposed impact of Chinese imports. However large the effect actually is, and however much may debate it, the significant thing is, for American society, China is the destabilizing force. And this is undoubtedly the largest success story of human development that we've ever seen. So just imagine for a second that that had happened not just in China. Imagine for a second if Brazil or Mexico had quadrupled their GDP per capita over the last few decades. There's no question that a lot of Americans would get rich. There's no question that many people would profit from this. But I think if you think that Washington would have taken this as geopolitically neutral and settled down to live happily ever after, sharing power in the Western Hemisphere with a Brazil that is 4 times larger in terms of GDP per capita, or Mexico, you're kidding yourself, right? Think about the geopolitics of Africa. If Nigeria actually attained the GDP per capita of Turkey, therefore became a global economic player on the size of a France or a Britain, larger than Brazil. Think about the power politics of the continent if Ethiopia or Nigeria, or both of them, achieved that kind of success. It would be spectacular. It would, of course, in the same way as I think we must welcome Chinese development, be something we would embrace. But on the other hand, the bets would be off as to the way in which the power politics of the continent would play out. If you want to know how this would look up close, I'm always impressed by conversations I have in Singapore with the long memories of the period of what's called konfrontasi in the 1960s, when Indonesia looked like it would emerge as the massive regional hegemon and was waging war against the newly independent Malaysian state and threatened Singapore's independence as well. Imagine Indonesia achieving a huge leap forward and how that would conceivably destabilize the regional politics. The point I'm trying to make is that sustainable growth when we achieve it is not by itself, or in fact is the opposite, generally speaking, of stabilizing to the geopolitical status quo. And it doesn't even have to be relative closure, right? China is the most dramatic case because it actually catches up with the West. But you don't even have to achieve that. Critically, I think, for the transformative, qualitative change that's produced by economic development is in fact more often than not crossing thresholds. So it's an absolute effect, not a relative effect. And the way I would think about this is, for instance, drone-capable players in Africa. Right? We thought of drones once upon a time as something reserved only for rich countries. Well, this is the number of African states which are currently importing drones from Western suppliers. These are data from the last month. And this isn't confined to state actors in Africa because of the potency of various raw material rackets that are run by non-state actors. The orange dots are the non-state actors which have become military drone capable by the spring of 2025. If you wanted to put a label on this globally, it's the Houthi phenomenon, right? We don't know whether they're a state actor or not, but they're capable with $10 million, $100 million defense budgets of destabilizing global trade with a little bit of technological and military help from Iran. That's the multipolarity. It's not an effect of actual convergence, it's an effect of crossing thresholds. And that lowers the bar dramatically for the disruptive effect of sustainable development. Ethiopia doesn't need to become a Turkey to fundamentally change the power balance in East Africa. If it can leap to lower middle income status, as it may very well, it will become a regional power of a type we've never had to deal with before. And it will attract the attention of the great powers and complicate the geometries of regional geopolitics in a way we're just not ready for. In a sense, what I'm saying is, the shock on the American side is they made promises on SDG they never wanted cashed. And only one of them had to be cashed, and that was the Chinese one, and that was enough for them essentially to bolt out of the framework. The fundamental point, to reiterate, is that only in happy fantasy, I think, is sustainable development all around compatible with the geopolitical status quo and the persistence of the American unipolar hegemony. It can be made to conform. The Americans are not too worried about the South Koreas, the Japans, the Australias, though they had a minute of anxiety about Japan in the 1980s. But it depends on political frameworks. It depends on geopolitical frameworks. And one of the striking things about the SDGs, not entirely coincidentally as they emerged out of development discourse in the 2000s and the 2010s, is that they are not just unpolitical, but anti-political. Right? They actually set out to specify a kind of development that doesn't require us to deal with it. And that, too, has a distinctively European flavor. Think about how Shimon Peres imagined a new Middle East in the 1990s to be delivered upon European lines because it was going to be an Abraham Accord mega with Palestine folded in that was going to deliver peace. There is a deep tendency on the part of Europeans, and notably Germans, to think that economic success, economic integration necessarily leads beyond national sovereignty, necessarily leads towards confederation, ideally leads you up to the world state of the UN. Think about Habermas in the 2010s speculating about the EU as a precursor to a world order. Whereas, historically speaking, the opposite is true. The vast majority of states that have pursued sustainable development have done it so as to resist external power and then to become powers themselves. Right? That's the point of development for the vast majority of players, is sovereignty. Because sovereignty is another word for collective freedom. And if the point of sustainable development is empowerment, then the classic way of understanding that within the nation-state framework is not immediately to sign on to a UN treaty in which you sign away your sovereignty. Your immediate impulse is to actually use it to empower your state to exercise a kind of sovereignty it's been previously denied. And that is the reality, I think, that we have not dealt with and is key to understanding the American defection from the paradigm. There's a more specific reason for thinking that there was always something weird about imagining that the Americans would in the long run go along with sustainable development as part of a long-run project, which is this historical chart, which is simply to say that no previous experience of hegemony in the modern sense has ever been compatible with environmental sustainability. The two models of hegemony that we know, the British Empire and the United States, were both of them foundationally set up on the basis, on the one hand, of fossil fuel exploitation, and on the other hand, of entirely non-sustainable, biodiversity-threatening forms of agro-industrial complex. That was their entire foundation. This gives rise to the rather French-sounding idea of the Angloscene, not the Anthropocene, but the Angloscene. And the Angloscene is British and American humanity fundamentally churning up the natural envelope. And if you look at fossil fuel emissions up to the 1950s, the overwhelming majority of them are actually coming first from Britain and then from the United States as the major sources of fossil fuel emissions. So the idea that we could have a shift to a sustainable post-fossil energy system whilst maintaining the status quo power system under American leadership is basically betting on a unicorn. It's betting on something that has never previously existed. Now, we all know that unicorns now do exist and they make you very, very wealthy, but that's basically the quality of the thought here. Somehow there is going to be a future beyond fossil fuel that will, and this is, of course, what the American conservatives sense, is that you lovely people in this room here are conspiring against American power. And actually, you all know perfectly well that this is the case. And when you say you want to realize the sustainable development agenda, you're actually saying, as they say in their letter to the United Nations, that you're smuggling in a geopolitics which is fundamentally hostile to the power of the United States. Right? So those seem to me the plausible alternatives here. We're facing something that's worse than a trilemma, because I don't think any part of this is compatible with any other part of it. Right? The tension between comprehensive global development and the environmental envelope is Jörg's ever-postponed promise that somehow we can get this done, and that's what everyone in this room is committed to somehow working on. That is what we want to deliver on. The comprehensive global development versus the status quo power system is what I'm calling the China/Houthi problem. In other words, as soon as anyone actually develops, they challenge the global power structure, and all you need to do is Houthi-level development, and you're challenging the global power structure. And then the final one is there any way in which we can imagine squaring an environmental envelope with existing power? And there's frankly no reason to think we can. That doesn't mean there's no historical warrant. It's conceivable that we might, but it will require a huge leap of imagination, of technology. It would require an absolutely massive effort to do that, and we shouldn't kid ourselves about it. And it will require lots and lots of politics. It will require explicit geopolitics. It's not just technology and economic growth that's going to get us there. We would actually need to somehow persuade the United States elite, founded as it is in fossil power, to give up that power. And so what is the political project that would enable that? I mean, once you've laid it out like this, you could easily ask yourself, how did 2015 happen at all? Right? What's our theory of the case? How did it happen? I mean, it's not reasonable that it happened on the basis of the analysis that I'm offering here. And so I'd offer you the following possible explanations. First of all, don't underestimate the Democrats. If the Republicans are scary, don't underestimate the Democrats, because the Democrats are, to an extent that it boggles the mind, players in the business of unfulfilled promises, idealism, or just rank hypocrisy. Like, it's not for nothing that they are the descendants of Woodrow Wilson, who is pilloried by people like Carl Schmitt as the ultimate hypocrite. Right? So this is one line of policy, and it's Clinton and Obama that do this deal. So we should be careful in dealing with them. The other point, I think, more serious perhaps, is that strategists under Clinton and Obama actually, and this makes them in retrospect quite sympathetic, unlike the Biden people, saw the change in the world coming, understood multipolarity was a historic fate. This is very much the Brzezinski view, for instance, and so preemptively want to make international and global rules to their advantage and tie the Chinese, the Europeans, and anyone else in as quickly as possible while America still has influence and sway. And I think that idea was quite powerful in both the Clinton and the Obama administrations. In retrospect, they seem sensibly modest in their understanding of where American power actually lay. There is also the idea, still current till quite recently, that Wall Street would actually do really well out of sustainable development. This is my dear friend Daniela Garbor's thesis about the Wall Street consensus, right? It looks glossy, it looks left-wing, it looks progressive, but basically if Larry Fink endorses it of BlackRock, you know where it's really coming from. Or if Mark Carney goes to Glasgow and says, I've got $133 trillion, you should be careful about what happens next, right? Because that's clearly big money lining up to do the best it can out of this transition, which would explain why we get sustainable development, because $33 trillion is a lot of money, and that power really does talk. If it were real, it would be a very powerful force. Then there is the fracking story and its deeply ambiguous implications for American climate policy, because in the extend and pretend version of American policy in the Obama era, fracking gas is the transition fuel. Fracking gas is what enables the Americans to sign up to Paris, because they know they're simply going to replace all their coal-fired electricity generation with fracked gas, which is super cheap, and it gets them huge CO2 gains. It's a little bit like the European strategy in the 90s around Kyoto, where you all knew that East European and the Soviet and Russia was going down, and so you could buy in. It's the hot air argument. The Obama people had this in their back pocket. And if you look at American decarbonization, it's heavily driven by frack gas. They go deeper into cutting coal out of their energy system than, unfortunately, the Germans do. And they can do that because gas is coming on so quickly. And the final element is, and this is, I think, where we really hinge, is they never thought it was going to go anywhere anyway. Right? They sign on to this knowing that if it ever got serious, they would have a veto power over it. And you see this built into the text of the documents that we celebrate, like the Paris Agreement of 2015. At the very last minute, in the last few hours, as I understand it, of the negotiations, the whole thing almost blew up because the French Secretariat inserted language which made it so binding that the American administration would have to present it to Congress. And they know since Byrd-Hagel in 1997 that you're never going to get this past Congress. And so it was written out, and the nationally determined contributions were lightened to the point where an American administration can sign up. It's a difference between should and must, or should and ought, or it's a legal, literally one word that changes it from acceptable to the American administration to a dead in the water, dead as a duck. It was always there. And what we're seeing essentially is the bluff of the Europeans, the Japanese, and all the other people of goodwill who went along with this, We went along with this knowing what the compromises were being called by the Trump administration. Because the Trump administration is basically saying, we call your depoliticized liberal bluff. We see you. We know perfectly well what your agenda is. It's obvious. We know you're trying to smuggle in a bunch of stuff with ESG and sustainable development goals. We're not going to buy that. We totally reject, and this is not just Trump, but Biden as well, the thesis that America must compromise because it's historically declining. No, America is going to die on the hill of exceptionalism. It's going to die on the hill of dominance. The China challenge, meanwhile, has fundamentally changed the game. So any American idea that they would play a leading role in the renewable energy field is dead in the water, and they all know it, which is why they move around the issue. Blended finance, with all due respect to Daniela, looks amazing on paper and has, I don't think, ever delivered even as much as $1 billion in profit to anyone anywhere. In other words, it's peanuts. It's irrelevant. It doesn't work. It's not actually an engine for the transformation of global finance under the sign of green. It just is it's an illusion. It's a Potemkin village. It's to make people like Carney look good on the global stage. And in the meantime, the US has emerged not just as a low-cost gas producer, but as the largest world-bestriding oil producer we have ever seen. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to reckon with this reality. America is now substantially larger than Saudi Arabia or Russia in the global oil field. They are not retreating. Any European hypothesis about the end of fossil fuels is just utterly irrelevant in the American context. The American assumption is fossil fuels are forever. American fossil fuels are forever, and it's a matter really of how large the export market is. It's a very dramatic historic shift that we have to do justice to, tightly tied up if we want to get into the details with the QE policies, the expansive monetary policies of the early 2010s, which made it so cheap to invest in fracking. Different story now because it's actually owned by big oil, and so they're much more sensitive to price signals and interest rate costs than they ever were before. And as the Harvard case makes clear, which I started with, don't expect sanity to return to the United States anytime soon. I mean, we really are in a death spiral of culture wars-driven political self-entanglement. It's hard to communicate to the outside world just how irrelevant the vast majority of global politics is in the United States in the current moment. What we're caught up in is domestic culture wars, immigration policy and xenophobia, Israel-Palestine anti-Semitism accusations, and China and the CCP. And that's the whole game, and it's utterly depressing. So what does this mean immediately? Let me move to my concluding remarks, my concluding comments. First of all, I think we need to do justice to the impact and where this is going to be most severe. And the place it's going to be most severe for the developing world is Central America and northern South America. This is an astonishing graph, and the thing to focus on is the red bar at the end. And what's that telling you is that terror works. So this is the number of arrests of migrants from Central America and elsewhere made on the borders of the United States month by month. And that figure in March 2025 is 7,100 people compared to a flow in the late stages of the Biden administration of close to 200,000 people a month. So what that's telling you is that the Central American migrant movement doesn't want to end up in one of Bukele's jails. Right? Those people are making the choice. They're opting out of the incredible risks that you now run in making an illegal dash into the United States. That will have huge reverb on the economies of the region because mass migration out of the crisis-torn, really in the heart of polycrisis Central American states, is a key valve that sustains their societies, and the remittances from there are critical for their regional economies. So we shouldn't take our eye off the ball. We can't just stay global. We have to look where this crisis is going to impact. It's 100 million plus people that are in the crosshairs of this, and the impact is already there. Those doors have already shut for those migrants. The second point is obviously the ODA budgets. I'm sure that's been on people's minds all day long. America is a hugely outsized contributor to ODA, nowhere near as much as you'd want in relation to American wealth, but in relation to what everyone else gives, it's significant. And then the third element is that there really is, at this point, I think, zero scope. We'll be lucky if the Bretton Woods institutions actually survive, is one of the scenarios which we started the year with. Briefly, what are the implications of this for a European-centered policy? Since we're in Berlin, we should ask the question. And I want to suggest 5 different points. I mean, I think the first thing is to recognize the scale of the emergency, and if I'm trying to do anything here this afternoon, it's to really bring that home in my own terms, what kind of an emergency is. This is sight and vendor squared. This is even bigger than what we were seeing in 2022. The second thing is, I think this makes the urgency of focus even greater. And I don't know about you, but I have a checklist of places I really, really worry about, and that's my checklist. People can have their own views. They can have their own views about whether or not we should have checklists. You might prefer various types of complex multilateral regional structure. But I'm really worried about Central Africa, Horn of Africa, Egypt, Iraq, Pakistan, Bangladesh. If you do the climate map, you know why. If you look at the finance stress map, you know why. If you look at Europe's scrambling emergency funding to Egypt last year that no one was really paying attention to, you know why. I believe everyone in the centers of power knows why these are too big to fail, or at least in some cases, in the case of, I believe, Egypt, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, too big to fail. The real question about the two other zones of mega crisis in the current moment is how they're allowed to go on in the state that they're in. Not that I have any patent answer, but I think focus is essential. And I am impatient with strategies which don't actually address what I take to be everyone's understanding of the really critical zones. Places like Iraq are going to become unlivable in the summer in the next decade. People are taking refuge in their cars, running air conditioning all night long just to get through the night. It's dramatic. There are deep political choices to be made with regard to the regional partners that you play with in making policy. And these are not easy. This is where the politics really comes in, the idea that you can do sustainable development without thinking through what it means to be a partner of the Emirates is an illusion. Or Rwanda, for that matter, a key partner of many European players in the region. There are, for the Europeans, and I say this advisedly and with heavy emphasis in Berlin, there are hugely significant political choices to be made with global ramifications. And again, you're kidding yourself if you can profess to be a plausible global player in the development sphere and take the line on Israel that the German government has done since the beginning of the crisis. It just won't work. You can't do that, right? And then finally, there is the question of budgets. And it's all about budgets, and we have to stop pretending that blended finance works. It doesn't work. It's an excuse for a policy. And if we're serious about it, we need to be talking about percentage points of GDP, and we need to be talking with the same earnestness and speed and expedition which the Germans finally have mobilized around defense. And it's an obscenity that they're able to do that around Ukraine and the Russian threat and not able to do it around. It's a real Armutszeugnis. It's a sign of immaturity. And it's by no means, of course, limited to German politics. It's just particularly striking here because we've had this convulsive move out of stagnation and paralysis on defense to 5%, which is the sort of level we all know we need to be at for the energy transition. If we could get to 5% of GDP on the energy transition, we'd be in the game. We'd be China on that more in just a second. We'd be for real. And until we're at that level, we're not for real, and we should stop pretending. Right? So those, I think, are the big challenges. But the real point that I want to make is that this song is no longer about us. This is my Carly Simon quote. You know, you're so vain, you think this song is about you. We need to stop being vain. This is not any longer about us. It's not about the choices that well-intentioned Europeans and Westerners make at this point. Right? This isn't to say that there aren't important differences. The EU, the UK, Japan are not like the United States, or Canada or Australia for that matter. Right? They have much lower per capita emissions, especially amongst working class people. They're pretty close, as Thomas Piketty said already in 2015, to a sustainable level if you actually go to a modest European level of consumption. The publics are broadly supportive, and there's been real decarbonisation in the low-hanging fruit areas. We all know what they are. It's electricity generation. You replace coal with something better, and you get real benefits. That's actually happened, and it's important. But our track record collectively speaks for itself, and I'm going to show you data in a minute, which we all know them, but we have not delivered. For 50 years, we've been banging on about sustainable development as a central historical challenge, and many people have made honourable lives in the struggle over that challenge, but we have to admit the modesty of what has actually been achieved, and fundamentally, therefore, the lack of credibility that the West has as an actor in the really dramatic changes that lie ahead. Now, let me just dramatise this with some really kind of quite hokey diagrams, but I still find them useful to shock myself into a realisation about this. I mean, this is the reality of the last 50 years. I picked it because it was a 50-year chart, not because it's a particularly good one. But that is the combined total of the CO2 emissions reduction achieved by Europe since the beginning of the realisation of the problem. That twitch. Now, this data stops in 2024. If we took it to 2025, it would go to about there. Right? That's how much all of this effort has actually achieved. The United States is now at higher levels of emission than it was in 1970. It's not actually achieved any reduction at all. And meanwhile, the entire world has changed around us, and the two really dramatic movements are the purple line. That's China, by itself, blasting through any conceivable level, previous conceivable levels of emissions, and then the rest of the world growing much more steadily over the top of it, and in the long run, very consequentially, because that's an awful lot of players, all adding up with steady, steady growth over a long period of time. So if we want to do what we want to do, we need to go through the looking glass. We need to turn this around. And then what we need to do is we need to speed up time, because that's 50 years. That won't do the trick, so we need to take it like that. Right? And then what we need to do is crash land that graph. We all know this, but just see it graphically, and you realize what the scale is of what we're talking about. We need it to go not to where we were in 1970, but to 0 by 2050, 60, give or take a decade, for everyone from the levels which the rest of the world and China have attained. And we're going to do that in the face of what we know to be ongoing development around the world, which includes the global population rising to over 10 billion by 2050, global GDP per capita, and climate change is not going to stop this. This level of development is 2.5% per annum. It's very modest. It goes from 12 today to 20,000. So the levels of consumption globally just go through the roof. And total GDP globally that needs to be decarbonized goes from 110 trillion to 200 trillion in modern day money. That's 10 times the current GDP of Europe. That's what it means to do sustainable development by 2050. And it's utterly daunting when you look at it in these sort of simplified terms. And the next question, of course, is who can do this? And it is just radically, historically implausible to me that the people who managed to do that, or the people who didn't manage to do anything, really have any valuable lessons of any kind to teach anyone on this question at this point. We had the knowledge, we had the wealth, we had the affluence, we had the technology, we had the finance, we had endless conversations over decades and decades and decades, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we managed to do. Now, you can't blame us for not stopping China's growth, but you can ask why on earth our line is still where it's at. But we can consign that to the dustbin of history. That's not our question anymore. The question to decide what happens next is what the big emerging market players do in this space, right? It isn't the EU and the US that decide this. It's only, and can only be, just look at the graph to imagine that the Europeans can somehow address, given their modest achievement, that huge surge in global emissions, or the Chinese story is clearly, I think, bizarrely wide of the mark. Now, we know what China's done, and we have a pretty good idea from policy studies how they did it. And it's not magic, ladies and gentlemen. It truly isn't. If you want to have an electric vehicles industry like the Chinese, if Germany had wanted to have it 20 years ago when the Chinese got serious about it, you would have set policy, you would have spent money, you would have set incentives, you'd have put the stick about when you needed to rationalize a little bit. It's not magic, it's not command economics, it's highly competitive, and they did it because they've had lots of different reasons to do it, including beating the Germans at their own competitive game. And apparently the Germans slept while this was happening. But it's possible to do that, right? This is not a thing, kein Ding der Unmöglichkeit. You can transform an industry. And the key players that are going to have to do it, if we take seriously these numbers, are the grouping that is basically identified as basic. It has to be the key players, which are Brazil, India, China, and South Africa as a key partner, at least, right? Ideally, one would look for a G20, a G30 kind of configuration to do this. And the history of this is real, right? This is not slow-moving stuff. So this is data I calculated from IRENA last week. This is the latest IRENA release from April. And what it shows you is that this is not slow-moving, right? So this is the history of European leadership. This is the glory days of the Böll Foundation of the Greens up there, when Germany was responsible for 2/3 of new solar and wind additions, right? So Europe led, it really did lead. And then the financial crisis happened and the Eurozone crisis in Europe itself. It isn't China that does that, that's Europe doing it to itself. China then takes off and reaches the 45 to 50 share before 2020. And then this is the real story. China surging in the last 2 years to over 60% of global emissions. That is history. The Chinese are making it, right? This isn't a story of the Chinese having some long structural advantage they've always had. This is the Chinese moving faster and with vastly greater energy than we have ever done. I mean, take that number up there. The Chinese have added in the last 2 years, what is it? 3 times as much renewable energy capacity as Europe and the United States together. 3 times as much. Right? So this is the scale of action that's necessary. There has never been action in the West on this kind of scale. Let's step away from this and come to the conclusion with a couple of other really dramatic demonstrations of where we go, because this is the solved problem. If we don't buy Chinese photovoltaics, we're choosing to heat the world. If you want to prioritize rapid decarbonization, you buy the results of this one-off. Literally in the history of our species, this is what the Chinese are doing, right? We know we need to do something radical. There it is. So what about the hard-to-abate sectors? This is the easy-to-abate bit. What about the hard-to-abate sectors? So let's focus on 2 to end. Steel and cement. We know they're fundamental to infrastructure. We know they're hard to decarbonize. Who are going to be the actors? We know there's a huge conversation in Germany about Thyssen and green steel and endless, all of us have been in endless workshops on this. But ask yourself for a second who actually makes steel. Have we forgotten that from the 1970s onwards, the locus of heavy industry shifted away from the West to Asia? And have we forgotten the scale of what happened in Asia, such that the current state of play is that China alone produces more than half of all steel produced in any given year? I mean, this is a staggering shift in the balance. So the only place where large-scale decarbonization of steel can realistically be performed and where it must be performed is obviously in the place that it's produced, and that is essentially China and India. You might say, well, hang on, Tooze, what about the European Union? We're still in there, we're still players. That's a deception, and it's a deception of using national economic statistics rather than what we all know matters, which is corporate level. Which businesses is it are the big players in steel? And this is the list of the top 10 steel producers and their locations. And that ArcelorMittal, we all know, is located in Luxembourg as a matter of convenience. That's an Indian business. So every single one of the top 15 steel producers in the world is an Asian-centered producer. The solution for decarbonization of the most basic heavy industries has to come out of where they're located, and that's in Asia. The first Western firm on this list will be in place 15. That would be the American firm Nucor. ThyssenKrupp, the national champion of German green steel, comes in at 41st in the list. It's responsible for 0.5% of global steel production, which gives you an idea of what kind of a platform that offers you for doing a transformative technology shift in the world. An important laboratory. They make 10 million tons of steel a year, shouldn't be ignored. But clearly the problem is, in fact, to decarbonize the great Asian producers. Those are really also the bluff that we should call in our conversations with our Indian colleagues about CBAM, because basically they object to CBAM, and yet it's their steel producers that are in the crosshairs here, and those aren't small businesses. Those are the oligarchs of China. How about cement? And this is a more optimistic note. If you wanted to find a world historically relevant place for Europe to intervene in decarbonization right now, it would be cement. It's as mundane as that, but seriously, folks, that's the most optimistic thing I can offer you. Focus on cement. European producers are key players in the cement industry. We all know it's important, and I think it gives us an appropriate sense of where we fit in the world historic food chain at this particular moment. Thank you very much for your patience.
Ja. Wir gehen mal auf die andere Seite.
Well, I switch to the other side. There's more space on this side.
Sollen wir Deutsch, einmal Englisch?
Well, German, English. Okay, German.
So, ja, als Adam mir
when Adam
PowerPoint geschickt hat, dachte ich, okay, wir können jetzt nicht einfach
sent me the PowerPoint, I thought, okay, we cannot just finish on that note. There is going to be need to talk. Carlos, do you have the interpretation equipment? A receiver?
We continue for a moment in English.
Bedarf is this great German phrase, which is a need to talk.
Yeah, exactly. So when I saw this, when I saw this slide deck, I thought, okay, there will be need to talk. This is not the usual conversation we are having, and therefore we couldn't just end this with 5 minutes or whatever. So we thought, okay, we will open up the floor for questions and answers, and actually. I asked Carlos whether he would be interested in commenting or reacting or in any way, speaking to this, and you said yes. So so maybe you just your comment.
Thank you, Adam. Fascinating presentation. Normally I like to frame the discussion in the 3 megatrends: demographics, climate, and technology. Yeah. And I think what you presented covers the climate one very well. So I have nothing but to agree with this assessment that, in fact, I offered this morning by challenging the targets. And now we have become engulfed and indulged in these sort of targets that don't make any sense because they are not realistic and they are no longer going to be the basis for discussion. Therefore, we create mistrust and we, basically create this impression of false consensus. We can even use the word fake consensus. But now when it comes to climate, when it comes to demographics, I have a couple of questions that would like you to elaborate because I have a slightly different view. Like, for instance, when you say that the Central American countries and the northern part of South America are going to suffer because of the migration stopping at the border. Immediately. Well, the US is probably going to suffer more. Because the implications are that a lot of the developments that have taken place in the US were the result of migration. What happens to Harvard is very much, indicative of not understanding that the talent worldwide has become one market. It's the only one that doesn't have any borders. And if you stop talent from moving, basically you are going to suffer the consequences of it. Silicon Valley is mostly led in terms of corporate CEOs by Indians. If you start, acting in a way that does not allow for mobility, you are going to suffer the consequences of it. On the same vein, I think what is happening in China is also, to a certain degree, an acceleration due to the fact that the Chinese have watched very carefully. They are long-term sort of players. What happened to Japan? And they know stagflation is around the corner because of the aging of their population. So whatever window of opportunity they have, it's now, and they have to accelerate it, and they are doing it. But, they are very conscious that the value chains of the future are going to be very different, and they are already investing in a way that takes into account that development. And to a certain degree, I think what is happening in Europe is not understanding these dynamics, being completely unaware of some of the demographic shifts that are actually tectonic and that are not going to allow things to be the way they were until now. And partly because we are going to see a correlation between the possibilities for us to adjust societies for higher technology with the aging of their population. It's pretty clear to me, and I think it's pretty obvious to everybody, to a certain extent, that the older you are, the more difficulties you have in absorbing tech intensity. And it can be in processes and products. And this is going to be a hallmark of how we are going to react to these changes, which brings me to the last one, which is about technology. I think people are not really taking into account the impacts of both artificial intelligence in imploding the way we measure value, and therefore, creating the conditions for us to actually attribute value in a productive system that has been geared to actually do things completely different. Value in the future is going to be not based on intellectual property regimes as we know them, but much more in the highly concentrated capabilities of algorithms to read and identify language. And even that is going to be disrupted by quantum computing, because it's going to put in question the encryption as we know it, and therefore stealing that is already starting with artificial intelligence is going to intensify much more. And we are not really in a world where the capabilities of the regulatory systems can cope with such changes. Yeah. So who is going to take that on board first? And I think that explains a lot why the Americans are acting the way they are acting. So I think there is method on the madness. It's not completely full. Maybe the drama and the part where the actor is not a very good actor is the one that we are noticing the most. But there is something behind that is a bit more elaborate. And that elaboration is basically how we are going to manage decoupling. And this decoupling is not just the identity of ideological choices. It's going to be much more based, in my view, on how we are going to adjust for a tech intensity that is going to have key players, highly concentrated, mostly in the US and China, that would like to first confront each other for hegemony, but second, to protect themselves from quantum computing and all the stealing. Yeah. So they have to do both at the same time. Yeah. And if we go in that type of sort of trajectory, yeah, some of the players that have been responsible for a lot of the wealth creation in the world are going to find themselves in a bind, because they are very much trying to identify the changes that are needed in the world in terms of legacy rather than constructing the new.
May I respond to that before we take any more? Because that's so rich that I'm worried that I'm going to lose track if I don't. So I don't think I disagree with anything that you've said. I think that would be a fantastically interesting extension of some of the the thoughts that I was trying to articulate. I mean, maybe one might put it. I think. Thank you for saying what you said about the climate piece, and I think the climate piece that I centered makes life a little bit too simple for us, because it's so materialistic, or at least in the version that we think about it, it's materialistic. So we end up talking about steel and cement. We don't talk about value. We don't talk about AI. We don't talk about these intangible things that actually make up capitalist economies and their logic. And that's a weakness or temptation of a climate-based discourse, which I exploited to full effect this evening. I agree with you with regard to the future of the world economy, value generation and profit. It's not obvious that this is the place to be, cement or steel. In fact, it's pretty obvious it's not the place to be, because they're sectors with massive overcapacity. But from the point of view of physical development and from the point of view of climate, they're crucial, and that's why I put them at the heart. And there are known technological problems that we need to address. If we move to the issue, the juxtaposition that you had of demography and tech, it seems to me to combine a really tantalizing combination of certainties on the one hand and radical uncertainty on the other, right? And the certainty is to a large extent the demography through at least 2050. That's because demographic trends are slow moving. We know how many young women have been born. The ratio of young women to total population regulates your overall fertility. We know there is a downward trend in fertility, but it's within margins. We have as mega trends go, we have a better chance of predicting global population in 2050 than virtually any other big variable. And that's something we know. And two things we know about it, or three things we know about it. Rich countries are aging, And Asian societies, East Asian societies, are aging at an absolutely spectacular rate. And I think that has to be understood in terms, above all, of an impasse in gender relations, which I take to be one of the absolutely fundamental megatrends of the current moment. The fact that women all over East Asia are simply no longer willing to accept the fertility bargain. And that's driving this collapse in fertility that we're seeing in China and South Korea and Japan. So there's a huge disjuncture there. The other thing that we know goes to your skill point, which is that there has been a revolution in global higher education. These are numbers I unpacked recently because I was thinking about global higher education in crisis because I'm at Columbia University in New York, so I have to. 40% of the current cohorts of young people worldwide are enrolled in higher ed. 40%. One of the disasters of Sudan right now that is undercovered is a total destruction of the Sudanese academic infrastructure in the context. It's not as bad as what's happening in Gaza, but it's nevertheless devastating. And Sudan was a major center of medical education in East Africa. Nodes like that emerging all over the world, which feed Silicon Valley at the end of the food chain, which then sucks all this up in the giant brain drain. So we know those two things: aging populations in the rich world, a huge surge in human capital, like a generational shift that will benefit the entire world. We see it all around us. And the third is Africa, 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 right? I think it's in one of your publications, 25% of all humans alive in the world by 2050 will likely be African, right? That is a thing we kind of know. And are we ready for it? No, absolutely not. In no way whatsoever, at no level, right? Not locally, not regionally, not nationally, not European-wise. It's staggering how dramatic that shift is. And we have never seen it before, right? You have this sort of silly idea that somehow Africa is a poor country, therefore high population density. No, of course not, right? The history of the African continent is of low population density for a variety of different complex reasons. So a densely populated Africa with countries like Rwanda having European levels of population density is a total historical novelty and one we have to think through. That's the certain side, you know, and that's daunting enough. Then we move to the technology side, and it seems to me that we know it's huge. Anyone who's used AI seriously knows the LLMs are extraordinary in what they're able to do, and this is just the second or third generation. 5 years down the line, this is going to be even more transformative. There's no question about that. But I simply don't think we understand yet how that's going to play out, what that's going to do. You know, there's some easy scenarios you could pitch. One would be a massive concentration of power in the global north with huge dominance of global data centers. If you want to see a metric on which the United States leads China by a country mile, it's none of the physical stuff, it's data center capacity. The Americans have massive capacity. So it may be the Chinese are going to be smarter and they can develop smarter algorithms that lose less crunching power, but that's a formula that's worked for America in the past. It might work in the future, mass. But let me just to conclude, give you an alternative vision, which I came away from several visits to India impressed by, which is the potential of tech to serve a kind of holding function at lower middle income in societies which don't build massive state infrastructure, don't really solve endemic, massive, comprehensive poverty problems, don't really solve the basic problems of infrastructure, but compensate with, exactly as you're describing, young generations of incredibly tech-enabled technicians who build a digital state that holds modern Modi's India together, right? India is way ahead of anywhere in Europe, let alone Germany, in digitizing the state apparatus. And one of the things they're able to do thereby is basically end famine in India. They did the 2020 absurd COVID lockdown, and though people suffered, very few people starved to death. In any previous episode in Indian history, we would have had a huge mass casualty incident. And one of the reasons that didn't happen is they have this massive digital infrastructure. So I think it could play out in very ambiguous ways for large developing countries stuck. You know, this could be a solution, it already is in large parts of East Africa, right? Various types of highly sophisticated digital infrastructure compensating for a lack of big businesses, big banking facilities, big infrastructure of the type we know from the 19th and 20th century. So that, for me, is the game here, the certainties, which are the demography or relative certainties, and the big unknowns on the tech side. And given the global balance of education, I think it's a story that could be told in a very optimistic way. I mean, I know American entrepreneurs who routinely use coders from Ethiopia because they're so good, they're so cheap. The real problem in Ethiopia is the government keeps turning the internet off and during political emergencies, and that interrupts their ability to sell their services to Silicon Valley, which happily snaps them up, right? So there is a huge potential leverage there between the tech-enabled youth, which is going to be African and South Asian, and global consumers and global markets and global business and capital thereby in the long run.
Ja, ich gehe zurück auf Englisch, auf Deutsch, sorry.
Well, I'll switch back to German. So it's a very interesting conversation and far-reaching. I think somebody wanted to ask a question over there, and then two people over here.
Fangen wir da mal an. Ups, Elena hat. Und wie immer kurze Fragen oder kurze Kommentare.
And can you please be brief?
Auf Deutsch oder Englisch?
Geht beides.
German or English? Well, both is possible.
I missed the, let's say, historical analysis, since the cement production and the steel production are children of, let's say, post-war societies in which was a shortage of houses, shortage of infrastructure, and the whole economic system we are using to describe our current world is a child of poverty in the whole Western world. So let's say industrialization was answering the need for certain goods, of which we have a lot right now. That's what I wanted to add, and that's what's as well described with the cement and iron production, since in countries such as India and China there is a high need for that, and that's one hand of the thing, and the other hand is whether we are able to transform our societies after we met all the needs of people without let's say, generating new consumption habits, which are already ruining large parts, let's say, the plastic in the ocean and climate change and a lot of further problems. Since all the wealth will not use us anything, the concrete and the steel will not give us any kind of wealth if we just fuck everything up. Or are there any, or I miss anything with this analysis? Since I miss it completely, I miss this perspective.
Come back to the are we, you know, does having a house but fucking everything else up question is a great one. But let's have some more from the back, and then I'll cycle around.
Hi, I'm Jana. My question is around financing. So next week there is the financing, next month the Financing for Development conference in Seville. I think the last figure I saw is 6 trillion. That doesn't sound impossible to reach the SDG goals. Maybe you can comment on that. And then what role do you see for the multilateral system to meeting those challenges? Thanks.
Should we have one more? Woman at the front here. Here. Can we have the mic at the front here?
There was a let's hear from first, and then there are online questions.
Mine is a quick one.
Yeah.
Well, Bodo Elmers from Global Policy Forum. You made a lot of references to the SDGs and to the Agenda 2030 and that they could be agreed on despite the role of the USA. So what's the implication, to give you some chance to speculate into the future, for the post-2030 agenda, which is about to start? Does it make any sense? Are we going to have a universally agreed set of development goals at all post-2030? Or how it is going to look like?
I think, can we pause there?
Yeah.
Can we quickly respond to those? So on the history's in this graph. Like, that's what the graph was doing, is compressing that history. And it's history of the most absolutely dramatic kind. And it's a juxtaposition between a history which in the West, and largely in the United States and Europe, has ended. You know, Fukuyama's not entirely wrong in economic terms. Electrification, for instance, flat lines from the 1980s in Europe and the United States, with dramatic implications. You can see in the CO2 emissions a kind of steady state that's reached. European and American emissions are not rising rapidly in this period, while we realize they're too high, but they're not rising rapidly. And then we see a new type of economic history, which I think it's unhelpful to compare it to the story after 45. That's to a large extent a reconstruction story. This is on an entirely different dimension, right? This is China is pouring in just this little period here after 2010, in the space of 3 years, as much cement as the United States in the entire 20th century. And I think at this point, you know, in Engels' terms, quantity tips into quality. We have to recognize this as a dramatic new epoch in human development. When we say that China now produces half the steel ever produced in the world, what that means is, in historical terms, that you take the entire history of European and American industrialism, going back to the 18th century, and the British Industrial Revolution, and the Ruhr, and Pittsburgh, and the triumphs of the post-war period, and then China does all of that again in the space of 20 years. Right? That's not the old story continuing. That's a dramatically new story. And what drives it is the realization of the promise of comprehensive human development from the 1950s onwards, which is urbanization. Some people will say, oh, isn't this exports to Europe? Isn't this basically transferred emissions? 10 to 15% of it is. The rest is going into cement and steel, which is urbanizing 500 million people in the space of 20 years. 95%, imagine this as Germans, 95% of the apartments that Chinese currently live in today, 95% were built since 1995. Everyone in China, when you buy a house second-hand, it's called a used house in China, like a used car. Basically, no one lives in the current generation in a house anyone has lived in before. If you speak to a modern Chinese person and ask them what's their childhood town village look like, it doesn't exist anymore. It's been completely changed, right? So this is a transformative scale of change. And sure, plastic bags all over the Ganges are a real pain. But if you ask any average Chinese whether or not they'd rather live in what they previously lived in, which was, you know, very rudimentary accommodation or an air-conditioned apartment in Beijing or Shanghai or a third-tier city today, I'm afraid to say the answer is very unambiguous. And yes, clearly, as all of modern Chinese cinema and literature tells you, there is a feeling of loss, there's a feeling of nostalgia, there's a feeling of destruction, there's a feeling of, oh my God, what the hell did we do to ourselves? If this isn't actually fucked up, it's something really weird. But it's clearly better in terms of life expectancy, expectations, consumption standard of living, and the absence of the fear of starvation. Right? This is a society which came out of the 60s with mass starvation as one of its backdrops. So this is huge, it's transformative, and I really am with like 21st century Marxism, that is the theory of the CCP, when they say everyone else's experience is a prelude to ours. Because no society of their scale, 1.4 billion people, has moved as fast on this scale, under central direction, in the history of our species. There is literally no previous experiment that remotely compares. And we should be appropriately modest in relation to this. We may say, oh no, actually, you're one case in our large data set of 50 emerging market countries, and we think you're going to face a middle income trap. And if I were Chinese, I would say, boo, I don't believe you for a single second. Show me anyone's experience that's remotely parallel to this. The only people who are close to the South Koreans, who have also gone through a similar kind of surge in growth, but it's 1/20th the size, right? It's a fraction of the size of the Chinese experiment. Financing, 6 trillion, yes, 6 trillion every single year for the foreseeable future, right? The problem with those numbers is when we hear them, we think, oh, it's going to be an investment fund, like in Germany. We're going to put 150 billion euros in it, and then it'll all be good. No, it's 6 trillion a year for the foreseeable future. Then we're in the right ballpark. That's exactly the right kind of number. Everyone agrees. For a long time, the people who did these kind of calculations thought we could get by with 4 trillion. I don't think anyone actually thinks that's real. It's 6 trillion. As a share of global GDP, it's $110 trillion globally, so 6 trillion is less than Merz is promising to put into defense, so it's doable. The problem, of course, is there's no such thing as a world government. There's no such thing as a world state. We can make ourselves feel okay about that number as macroeconomists, saying, could we mobilize 6% of GDP? Of course we could. The problem is, what are the mechanisms? And the vain promise of the Mark Carney moment at Glasgow was that there was a Gesamtkapitalist, as Marx would say. There is a universal capitalist capable of orchestrating all of the money in the world, and it's Mark Carney. Like, he's the epitome, he is the personification of that model, that he is going to deliver that 6% share, it's durable. Not all of it, but maybe half of it will pay for itself. The rest has to be severely de-risked. And, you know, this is, at that point, you kind of begin to feel like a durable proposition. But it's totally fake, and this goes to the question at the back about the future. I don't think there's a cat's chance in hell of a renewed universal commitment, because this is where I started. The United States government is formally committed to voting against any such resolution and rejecting it on foundational grounds. If it includes any of the key elements of the original SDG agenda, it's dead in the water. It's not happening as a universal proposition. And then we don't know yet how the other coalitions line up around that. But if you count the Americans out, I think you could get convergence. Again, you see the American conservatives, we may despise them, and they really are deplorable people. Like, I'm totally with Hillary Clinton on this. They're deplorable people, right? But they are clear-seeing in a certain way, in that they're not entirely wrong. The elements of the CCP agenda, which I was hymning a minute ago, do reflect the real aspirations in a very concrete, materialized way of billions of people around the world. And they will take a fucked up world with too much plastic pollution in exchange for apartments with air conditioning as long as the power supply keeps running. Or at least that's what we think the bargain is, right? And so the Americans, I think, have a kind of double-edged line on this, which is that they reject it on ideological principle, but they also fundamentally worry that it's only their opponents that can deliver on it. And it's not obvious to me which one of those things they fear more. So to that extent, we're more back in the 1950s Sputnik moment, where the Americans aren't the unipolar, boasting, you know, antagonists who know they bestride the world. The Soviets got into space first. The Soviets launched the satellite. The Americans are moving from behind. And this time round, it's not in a Sputnik moment, massive investment in progressive technology. It's this retreat to a kind of fortress. But they're seeing something quite clearly, that a universal agenda ultimately is not squarely reconcilable with their narrowly understood strategic interest. And that, I think, is the basic reason why no vote, including the Americans, will be included. And who knows then how the Russians move and other players in this system if they're presented with this kind of proposition.
You had the last question was about. We had SDGs. It's all.
Oh, I got it.
It's all.
I think
okay.
I did all three.
We had questions online, and we have an Anwalt des Publikums, an attorney of the public.
Yes, we have two questions from the online participants. The first one is, Adam, you mentioned sovereignty as a sort of development value aspired to by up-and-coming countries. But in a post-national state world we live in, shouldn't this be looked at as part of the destructive endgame project we observe in the US now? And the second question is, what role can Germany have in filling up the gap left by the USA? Can Germany at all fill this gap?
So the first question is kind of perfect, because it starts from the premise, which I think is so problematic. Like, it starts by saying we are in a post-national world. And if you start from the premise that we are in a post-national world, then obviously a national state project can only appear atavistic. But you've built your conclusion into your framing. Like, are we in a post-national world? Like, does that even remotely begin to describe the reality of Asia in the current moment? India in a post-national moment? China in a post-national moment? Like, it's bizarre. Like, Israel in a post-national moment, the United States, Mexico in a post-national moment. They love Scheinbaum because she's such an incredibly powerful advocate of Mexican interests. And she says, screw you to Trump in a really clever way all the time. She's heroically popular as a national figure. That seems to me the conceit of a certain sort of European teleology, which said that that is the trajectory. And we moved out of that in the US. I mean, this goes back to the earlier exchanges, right? You know, my friends who were around the Biden administration, their wager was the only way we could get any of the good stuff we wanted. I mean, Jörg and I suffered through endless conversations with our dear friends on that side of the Atlantic. The only way to get any of the good, you know, forward-thinking policy we wanted was to make it as national as possible. It was only if you actually described it as essentially a national project in defiance of China, even at times in defiance, God help us, of the Europeans. This is where our conversations originally started. The Americans were also mobilizing around the CBAM. So no, that doesn't seem to me a plausible logic. Does this mean that we're headed in a positive, constructive direction, or are these national antagonisms dangerous? Yes, but that's what any theory of great power politics since the late 19th century has told us, right? That massive economic growth within the nation-state form, going back to classic imperialism theory, whether it's Hobson or Lenin, like, is saying that as soon as we moved in the late 19th century towards powerful nation-states with rapidly developing, technologically sophisticated capitalist economies, we had a very, very dangerous power dynamic playing out. And whatever way you read the China project, it's not first and foremost a universal project, right? First and foremost, it's a national strengthening project, delivering development for China, and that is what the CCP derives its legitimacy from. Everything I've said with regard would suggest that the way in which Germany is most powerfully relevant is in making credible, large-scale commitments to joint European action. And that's so banal as to barely need repeating, but it does need repeating. And that's the alpha and omega. I think Germany can, and institutions like Böll, German national institutions to that extent, are very important in taking the lead, but ultimately at the state level, it's only at the scale of Europe that this makes any kind of sense. And if for the Europeans, for many liberals, surely for the Green Party side of German politics, the post-national may not be a fact or a sociological necessity, but it's something that one wants to achieve, right, as a collective sense of development beyond the parochialism and the narrowness of national identity, then it only makes sense to think about development policy at all levels as part of a European project. And I mean, that's surely one element about the current coalition, which is so unpromising in so many ways, is that there are some signs that Merz kind of, sort of, maybe even actually is conceivably some kind of Christian democratic European, and that is not the worst. That's not the worst configuration. But that's I think the answer. Individually, I don't see any reason. It seems like the wrong kind of development move.
We have probably to close this, but just to react to your last thing about Europe. You know, Europe is at the moment discussing to setting an NDC, a goal of decarbonizing by 90% by 2040. 90% by 2040. And I don't know any major economy anywhere near this. And this will force Europe to be a pathbreaker on many of the industries. You know, so in pure quantitative terms, okay, this little European steel industry doesn't matter, but Europe will be the laboratory for the rest of the world. Can we do it or can't we do it? So in some way, it may still be.
I like that. I think that interpretation. I think I like that interpretation more than the old Brussels effect argument, right? Because the other way in which small was leveraged large was by way of market size. And as Europe's economy grows as slowly as it does, it has certain upsides. It makes it much easier to decarbonize if it's growing as slowly as it is. But it also reduces structurally its market power over time. But if you are not going to go down the Brussels effect regulatory route for influence, outsized influence, then I think this technological example first mover model is quite attractive. And I wouldn't discount that. But I do think the bigger comprehension problem for us right now is just the scale of this shift, right? The reality of the lurching shift of a new mode of heavy industrialization towards East Asia, not just in the 70s and 80s, but with such force in the last generation, right? It's so spectacular, it's utterly unprecedented in the historical record. And that does have consequences for the future, the main drivers. So I'm with you on the value of what Europe is doing. It's hugely ambitious. I mean, I need to ask you back, do you think there's at all any probability that will be achieved?
Let me put it that way. The European law is something which is relatively hard to change once you have it set in stone. So it creates a pressure. But we will see. I mean, it's likely that it will be approved if Merz and the coalition has still, committed to it. And if the Germans want it, the rest of Europe may go along. So let's see. Adam, we are more or less really at the end of the time we planned for this. The translators also have to, get their rest. Thank you so much, Adam, for the provocation, for the food for thought. Thank you all. I would now ask Marcus to come up and give us final words of, just saying us goodbye.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be a difficult task to close such a rich day. Ich schalte jetzt wieder auf Deutsch um. Wir blicken auf einen Tag, der unglaublich reich war an Diskussionen, an
in terms of discussions, controversies, and in parts also differing viewpoints. So allow me at the end, even though it's already quite late, to mention a few aspects of the many different things that have been mentioned today.
Wir beginnen mit heute Morgen mit
with a statement of this morning which goes back to Bretton Woods and which said that international cooperation is the best form of realizing the national interests. And we have seen throughout the day, and we ask, is it true? Is it still true? The international global cooperation on the North-South axis, is it more important than ever? I think yes. It is.
Dabei haben wir auch heute gemerkt, und
and we also heard today,
nicht nur von Carlos, sondern auch jetzt am
Carlos,
Schluss, dass wir
und
dass diese Täuschung die
a multitude of deceptions, so to speak, and that this lack of understanding leads to a lack of credibility in international cooperation. It leads to situations where we have to say, okay, we have to question ourselves, we have to question our narratives, our stories, and our expectations, and our realities with which we approach the other side, or with which we should approach each other. We will hear more tomorrow about that at the book presentation of self-deception, but today and also at the end, we heard a lot about deceptions in politics, which are widely spread. So maybe we should reassess these things, and the consequences should be brought back into society in coming to terms with everything, the democratic forces in our country, the European Union with all countries,
besser kommunizieren.
In order to better communicate.
Denn America First
because America
ist und bleibt
first is and remains a path that is not feasible for German or European international cooperation. Disruption or quick further development of an increasingly multipolar world without an institutional basis. Is this the right description for the realities, or is it the obsolescence of the Western paradigm, so changing times, 4.0 times 4, is this the actual description of the current realities? Then there is no way around it, and there should not be any way around a new dialogue. We need to talk, as we've said this morning. We need to talk to the people, institutions, the countries of the global majority, the global South. That's what we called it in the past, and maybe we should no longer use the term like that. So in this dialogue,
mit der Bereitschaft zum Zuhören unbeirrt gehen,
to listen without any limitations, and we have to limit our expectations. Maybe as Germany, we should give an impulse, be a strategic advisor, to bundled European responsibility in the future, maybe also with a view to the presidency in the United Nations and the General Assembly of the United Nations. Be as it is, the organizers, the Heinrich-Böll Foundation and SME, both stand for dialogues in the future. We would like to maintain this format and turn it into a focus
zu einem Ort, an dem Politik, Fachleute, interessierte
experts, interested citizens,
die anstehenden Herausforderungen offen diskutieren
upcoming challenges in an open manner and to take positions, to take sides.
Schön, dass Sie zum ersten
It's great that you were here for the first forum and have made such great contributions, so thanks to all of you. And I'd also like to thank the great aides here, the great helps of the organizers, the organizing teams on both sides, the Humboldt Foundation, Humboldt University and Böll Foundation. There are some pretzels and drinks out there, so please stay here for our ongoing debates, and please don't forget the book presentation in the main building of the Humboldt University, and please don't forget the very rich and interesting contributions today. Thank you very much for the great keynotes, especially what we've heard now, or also in the panels. Great thing. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for being here, and see you tomorrow. And tomorrow we will have the book presentation, Self-Deception. We can see Carlos Lopez tomorrow again, and many other faces tomorrow at the Humboldt University. And with these words, I would like to wish you a nice evening.
Bis auf Wiedersehen beim nächsten Berlin Forum on Global Cooperation. Dankeschön.
Thank you very much.